Well. The Ottawa Senators seem to be back in it. Welcome, guys, to another episode of Miss or Make the Playoffs. Today, and finally, we're talking about the Ottawa Senators, a team that I have been rooting for to make the playoffs for this whole season, essentially. And, they went through a dry spell towards the end of the season, and it looked like they were not going to make the playoffs. But because the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Florida Panthers, and other teams in the race for the two last wildcard spots in the East have been having a difficult time, extending their lead in the standings. The Ottawa Senators are still in it, and they won their last game. And they also blown out the Tampa Bay Lightning a couple games ago, 7-2. So it seems like they're starting to get back into their groove when it matters most. These last 7 to 9 games are going to be crucial for all these teams in the East, fighting for those two last wild card spots. And as of right now, it looks like the Ottawa Senators have a very good chance because other teams are choking, essentially. So, as you can see right now, Brady, Tkachuk, Tim Stutzle, who are having fantastic seasons this year, they look to be 40 goal scorers. And the last time two teammates on the Ottawa Senators had 40 goals were Danny Heatley and Daniel Alfredson in 2007, 2008. So that would be fantastic to see once again after all this time. You have Claude Giroux, fitting in so well with the Ottawa Senators. Alex Debrincat, which we're all hoping signs an extension with the Ottawa Senators, which I think they will do, and I'm very confident that they will do. Shane Pinto really finding his footing in the NHL. Um, and then you have Derek Brassard, a guy that they signed for very cheap during the offseason. And he's been a journeyman throughout his whole career, and he's finding a spot with the Ottawa Senators. A lot of good things for the Ottawa Senators are happening this year, and the cherry on the top would see them making the playoffs. But what are the chances of that happening? Slim or very high? What are your thoughts, Luca?
Well, okay. I'm gonna be probably on the negative side of the things here when I talk about the Ottawa Senators, and the reason I'm gonna say this is just because it's really goaltending. Okay, as of right now, they have Matt Shogard and Dylan Ferguson as their two goaltenders. Cam Talbot's been out with an injury. Anton Forsberg as well has been out with an injury. And the Senators, are relying on young goaltenders to essentially come in and save the day for them. And although they haven't been terrible, Ottawa's last 10 games haven't been the best either, right? They've won one, lost one. They just came off of a 5-game losing streak not too long ago. And then they beat Pittsburgh, lost to Boston, beat Tampa, lost to New Jersey, and then beat Florida. And although they lost to Boston and New Jersey, they were competitive in those games. They looked good in those games. There was a lot to be proud of. However, I think I look at Ottawa, and my concern is obviously in net, and their new acquisition in Jakob Chychrun is injured too. They don't have Josh Norris, who was out. Matthew Joseph looks like he's out too. So it's tough for Ottawa, and as much as I would love to see them do well. There's it begs the question of the Islanders are starting to pick it up. Pittsburgh looks like they're going to take another stranglehold potentially tonight if they win. There's a possibility with Florida. I know that they lost Ottawa yesterday, and Ottawa made it closer, but they're still not out of it yet. Buffalo, although they lost to Montreal and probably should have won that game, you know, are still not out of it yet. So it's tough for Ottawa. And if you look at their schedule, they play Philly next, which I think is a beatable game. They then play Toronto, and Ottawa always plays well against Toronto, so I think that that's a winnable game. And then they play Columbus, right? And that's a winnable game. But then they've got Carolina twice, Tampa again, Florida, and Buffalo. Ottawa's got an easy schedule. Honestly, I think realistically here, if I look at the games, they can beat Philly, they can beat Toronto, they can beat Columbus. I think they can beat Florida and Tampa, and I think they can beat Buffalo. And I honestly think they can win their next, 6 out of 8 games. But the problem is that is their goaltending gonna hold up? Is Shogard or Ferguson for the time being, considering the fact that Talbot, although he looks like he may be nearing a return, is not back yet. Is Shogard and Ferguson going to be able to drag Ottawa to that final wild card spot? I'm not sure. And as much as I want to be optimistic for it, at the end of the day, I just think that Ottawa is just going to fall a little bit short. Not because I want them to, but because at the end of the day, it's just I just don't see the dominoes falling in the right place. And I mean, if they would have had Talbot back, I think if Chychrun would have been there and they would have had less injuries, I would have been having a different conversation. But I just think that although their schedule isn't necessarily terrible and they have some winnable games, it's going to be tough to try to catch Pittsburgh and the Islanders, especially with the way the Islanders are playing lately. I just don't see how Ottawa can get that final wild card spot. And if they do, are they going to have a team healthy enough to compete with the Bruins for a 7-game series? I'm just not 100% sure they do.
For me, in my mind, I see the Islanders finishing first in the wild card spot, and I've been saying that since we've been doing this whole series.
Yeah.
Just with the moves they made, just the way that things have been going, they've been the most consistent team. Even though they went through a little bit of a losing streak at one point, it didn't hurt their chances significantly. The other teams, they were winning, then they started choking, and then they had to find their footing all over again. And it's been a trend for all the teams fighting for that last wild card spot, essentially, because in my eyes, like I was saying before, the Islanders are probably going to be a lock in the first spot. Second spot is open to all these teams. Winning against the Florida Panthers 5-2 was so, so, so big for them.
Yeah.
Beating Tampa Bay 7-2 was also big. Beating Pittsburgh 2-1 was big for them. But, losing in a shootout versus the Maple Leafs where they should have or most likely could have won. They drop a point there. Getting blown up by the Oilers, Flames, and Canucks didn't really help. Um, Close game against the Avalanche that they could have won as well, where they lost 5-4, and they lose against the Devils 5-3. So now looking at their schedule for the remainder of the season, they would need to beat the Panthers and Buffalo Sabres 100% because these are two teams they're going to be competing with for that wild card spot. So, like you were saying, it all comes down to goaltending and also trying to stay healthy. Losing Jakob Chychrun doesn't help, which having him on the team makes them so much better on defense. But seeing Thomas Chabot recently, he's been playing out of his mind. He's been playing fantastic, and a lot of people had criticisms towards his game this season, but he's playing amazing when it counts. And I'm hoping that Matthew Joseph is not out for a long time, and if they do make the playoffs, Anton Forsberg and Cam Talbot are back for playoff hockey, and Josh Norris, we don't know if he's going to be out for the playoffs as well, but we do know he's done for the regular season. So maybe getting him back would be fantastic. But just looking at the team as a whole, Stutzle playing fantastic hockey, Tkachuk as well, Giroux really fitting in, like I was saying, Debrincat playing well. They still have a very good team on paper despite the injuries. But like you were saying, goaltending is going to be a factor in whether or not they make the playoffs. And also, they need to count their lucky stars and hope to God that the Pittsburgh Penguins and Florida Panthers continue to struggle somewhat. And the Ottawa Senators need to win most of their games, like you were saying, in this remaining stretch
Yeah.
for that playoff spot. And if you look at the wild card race right now, it's very close. 77 points for Ottawa, 76 points for Washington, 77 points for Buffalo. Florida has 79. Pittsburgh has 82. And then you see a little bit of a gap between Pittsburgh and the Islanders, 3 points, but they have 2 games extra played. The New York Islanders with 85 points, and I think they're in a very good spot to make the playoffs. Like I was saying, look at their goal differential too. And if you look at their team, they're a team that has made the playoffs before. They're a team that has surprised in the playoffs, and even though they don't have Barry Trotz anymore, Barry Trotz's players are still there on that team, and adding guys like Engvall and Bo Horvat solidify their position to most likely make the playoffs. So for me, like I said, Islanders are probably a lock, but the other teams are going to be fighting neck and neck until game
Yeah.
80.
And
And yeah,
and and one of the most interesting things, and actually just looking back at a few games for Ottawa here, Ottawa could have had a lot more points, being in this position. They lost twice to Chicago in both games they played them. They lost 5-0, and then they lost in overtime as well to Chicago. So those are two games that, realistically speaking, they probably should have won, which would have put them, as of right now, if you add 3 points to the 77 they would have had, they would have been at 80, right? So you look at losses like that against a team like Chicago. That's a game that those are games they need to win, right? And then you look at other things, other games that they lost. They lost to St. Louis 2-1 early on, midway through the season. They lost to Nashville as well, 3-0 in a game they probably should have won. And obviously that 5-game losing streak where they lost to Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Colorado, and then Toronto didn't help their chances either. And I think that you know, that's where the deciding factor was, is that Western road trip and the losses to Chicago. You look at that, and if you can win one of those games in the Western road trip against Calgary, Edmonton, or even Colorado, I know there's no real standing implications in the sense where, um, you know, all these teams are in the West. But if you can beat one of those teams, that gives you 2 points, and then the 3 points against Chicago would have put them at 82, and they would have been tied with Pittsburgh right now. I just think that there's too much of a gap. I think a 5 point gap this late in the season with the games remaining for Pittsburgh and Ottawa, I just think is not enough of a close gap for them to go and essentially catch up, right? And for me, I think that there's going to be some crucial games left. I know that they play, like you said, right? They play Florida and Buffalo before the end of the season. Those are 2 games they have to win. But if Ottawa can go 6-2 in their next 8 games, there is a chance that they can do it. It's also going to be based on luck of the draw and what happens with Pittsburgh and the Islanders. But Ottawa needs to focus on winning those games. They got to beat Philly. They got to beat Columbus. If they can steal one of the 2 games against Carolina and beat Florida, Tampa, and then beat one of Toronto or Tampa, they'll be okay. But they, like you said, they got to beat Florida and they got to beat Buffalo if they want any chance at being closer to the playoff line. And obviously, what's interesting is that for the Ottawa Senators, it's a little bit of like a do or die moment, and the reason being is because although they're not going to finish bottom 10 in the standings, one of the things that's interesting is that if Ottawa drops some games and Washington wins and they fall out of the top 13 in the NHL lottery and they get into the top 13 in the NHL lottery, well, that's a lottery pick. And at that point, Arizona, who has Ottawa's first round pick, essentially gets themselves a lottery pick and another lottery pick for this draft. So Ottawa's got a lot to play for right now, right? And there's a lot at stake for this team. And so I think it's going to be very interesting. And obviously, if you're Ottawa or Florida, well, there's 2 teams that are essentially that have your first round picks that have lottery implications on them. You don't want to fall between those lines, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see what Ottawa and Florida are able to do. Obviously, Buffalo lost a very important game to the Montreal Canadiens yesterday, a game that arguably they needed 2 points to be closer to Florida, and they couldn't get it. That might ruin their playoff chances as well, especially with Tage Thompson being out. But it's going to be an interesting playoff race. I think those 3 plus Pittsburgh are going to be a fascinating situation to watch, and we'll see what happens. But if you're a Pittsburgh fan or an Ottawa fan tonight, you're watching the schedule closely because there's going to be some big games coming up for Ottawa fans to pay attention to. And obviously, just to look at the schedule, Pittsburgh's got Detroit tonight, so that's going to be very interesting. And then Florida plays Toronto tomorrow, which is also going to be interesting for Ottawa. So Ottawa is going to be keeping a close eye on those Ottawa fans, and I'm assuming the players too are going to be keeping close eyes on those 2 games.
For me, it all comes down to Game 74 for Buffalo and Pittsburgh. If they both lose Game 74, then it's anyone's game,
Pittsburgh's
in
game
my
74 is
opinion.
tonight against Detroit, so we'll
Yeah,
see.
so we'll see what happens there. But, like I said, the Ottawa Senators are a team that added a lot during the offseason.
Yeah.
And Dorian has been one of the most active GMs this season. And I just wanted to say that I'm so happy to see Ottawa trending um, upwards. And, they are a very young team with a good mix of veterans as well. And all they're missing is a good owner, most likely a guy like Ryan Reynolds, to market the crap out of this team. And a lot more players are going to want to play for the Ottawa Senators. It's going to be a desirable destination. So Ottawa is almost done their rebuild, in my opinion. Will they make the playoffs next year? Well, they're trending in that direction essentially. So I do believe that the future is bright for the Ottawa Senators. We spoke about Stutzle recently, and he's a bright spot and is a superstar in the making, or already is a superstar for the Ottawa Senators. And they have a fantastic culture. But if they do miss the playoffs, there's a lot of things to be happy about, and there's a lot of positives heading out of the season. Just take a look at the stats, for example. Thomas Chabot, 41.68 games. Jake Batherson, 58 points in 74 games. Alex Debrincat, 60 points, 74 games. Giroux, especially for his age, 71 points, 74 games. Brady Tkachuk, 77 in 74 games. Uh, Stutzle, 82 points in 70 games. Tkachuk and Stutzle could get 40 goals this season, and they have a couple people on this team that are past the 20 goal mark, which is really impressive. And yeah, there's a little bit of a dip when you look at the rest of the stats. But again, there's been injuries. There's been players that it took a while to get into the groove of their game, and also the Ottawa Senators are still learning. They're still very young, and these experiences will allow them to become a playoff team in the near future if they don't make it this year. But guys, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the Ottawa Senators. Will they miss or make the playoffs? And this concludes our series for the East in terms of miss or make the playoffs. We have one more team to cover, which is the Calgary Flames. I know there's probably a couple people saying, well, what about the Washington Capitals? Well, we all know the Washington Capitals are in this, losing mindset right now where they were sellers during the trade deadline, and they're just counting the season as a one-off, and they're going to come back strong next season after possibly having a very active off season this season. So, guys, we'd like to hear your thoughts again. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Young Guns podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for watching.